Now to an NBC News exclusive. The host of this hour, NBC News Chief Washington and Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, had a wide-ranging sit-down with CIA Director Bill Burns at the Aspen Security Forum. And let me tell you, there are a lot of major headlines coming out of this. We should also mention NBC Universal News Group is the media partner of the Aspen Security Forum. Andrea joins us now. Andrea, what did he tell you?
Well, it was such an interesting interview. Thank you, Chris. The CIA Director, William Burns, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, is one of the world's top experts on Vladimir Putin. And he's the last U.S. official to meet face-to-face with the Russian leader before he invaded Ukraine. And I spoke with Director Burns about Putin's state of mind and the implications of Moscow turning to Iran this week for armed drones.
I must admit that watching the images of President Putin and Iran's supreme leader meeting yesterday in Tehran did not exactly fill me with nostalgia, because most of the gray hair on top of my head came from negotiating with Russians and Iranians over the years. I mean, I think beneath the images that we all saw, the reality is that Russians and Iranians need each other right now, both heavily sanctioned countries, both looking to break out of political isolation as well. But if they need each other, they don't really trust each other in the sense that they're energy rivals and historical competitors.
We know what Russia's original strategy was, which was to take Ukraine, and that the U.S. does not believe he'll ever be able to do that because of the resistance and the effectiveness of the Ukrainian force. But the persistence, and John Kirby saying that now he wants to go beyond Donbass and go south and go west and approach Odessa. What do you think his current strategic goals are?
I've watched and dealt with Vladimir Putin for more than 2 decades now, and I've watched him stew in what is a very combustible mix of grievance and ambition and insecurity. He's professionally trained to be a cynic about human nature. He is relentlessly suspicious, always attuned to vulnerabilities that he can take advantage of. He's not a big believer in the better angels in the human spirit. He's a big believer in control and intimidation and getting even. He really is an apostle of payback in a lot of ways. I say that because in my view anyway, all of those qualities have hardened over the course of the last decade as his grip on power has tightened, as his circle of advisors has narrowed, his own personal sense of destiny and his appetite for risk has grown significantly over that time as well. And nowhere is that, and I guess what I would say on the issue of his narrowing circle of advisors, the reason I mention that is when I was ambassador in Moscow now more than a decade ago, there were still, fairly wide circles of people who Putin would listen to. Some of them would disagree with him sometimes. There's virtually none of that now. His very constrained circle of advisors either agrees strongly with him or has even harder views, and many of them are professionally trained like he was to have those views, or they've discovered a long time ago that it's not career enhancing to question his judgment. So I say all that because nowhere are those views harder than on Ukraine. And that's how I think we need to understand Putin's decision-making in the run-up to the war.
You were the last American official that we know of who sat across the table from Putin in November of last year, warning him against an invasion. Tell me about that, the dynamic there.
The president asked me to go to Moscow and lay out our serious concerns about that in an unusual amount of detail to President Putin and some of his closest advisors, and then to lay out the serious consequences that would unfold if he chose to execute that plan. I must admit I came away from those conversations even more troubled than when I arrived. Putin himself made no effort to deny the planning. And while the impression I conveyed back to the president when I got home was that Putin hadn't yet made an irreversible decision to launch that invasion, he was clearly leaning hard in that direction at that point, too. My further impression was he had convinced himself strategically that the window was closing for his ability to control Ukraine and its choices.
Would you describe him as unstable? unhealthy?
No, I mean, there are lots of rumors about President Putin's health, and as far as we can tell, he's entirely too healthy. It's not a formal intelligence judgment. No, he's got his own, as I said, his views have hardened in my experience over the years, but he's got his own way of looking at reality. And as we could see in the first stages of this war, it was based on some profoundly flawed assumptions and some real illusions, especially about Ukraine and the will to resist in Ukraine, which he's helped to create in many ways by aggression now over a period of at least the 8 years since 2014.
Is the big picture that you think Russia is planning to dig in, keep hammering Ukraine, and believe that when winter comes and the fuel costs are so high on Europe that NATO solidarity will weaken?
Well, I mean, I'd say several things. I mean, first, after those catastrophic failures in the first phase of the war, the Russians and the Russian military have adapted. One of my recent conversations with one of my Ukrainian counterparts, he pointed out that the dumb Russians are all dead. And I think what he meant by that, at least what I took away, is that, in terms of their small unit tactics in the Donbass and elsewhere, the Russians have adapted, certainly their leadership. Putin's bet, just as you said, Andrea, is that he can succeed in a grinding war of attrition, that they can wear down the Ukrainian military, that winter's coming, and so he can strangle the Ukrainian economy, he can wear down European publics and leaderships, and he can wear down the United States, because Putin's view of Americans is that we always suffer from attention deficit disorder and, we'll get distracted by something else. I think my own strong view is that Putin was wrong in his assumptions about breaking the alliance and breaking Ukrainian will before the war began, and I think he's just as wrong now.
I want to ask you about Brittany Griner and the other wrongful detainees and the families complaining today that the administration is not doing enough to try to do prisoner swaps. You've been involved in these negotiations in the past. What are the obstacles to prisoner swaps, not just in Russia, obviously in Iran, wrongful detainees in a number of these countries?
Yeah, I mean, I say this as much as an American citizen, a fellow American citizen, for Brittany Griner and for Trevor Reed, who was released recently, and Paul Whelan, who's still being wrongfully detained by the Russians. These are awful and shameful steps to hold American citizens for political leverage as well. I mean, in Brittany Griner's case, my heart goes out to her wife and her family as well. I've been through these kind of cases in the past in my old life as a diplomat, and it's very painful as well. And the Russians are, quite cold-blooded about this right now as well. In the case of Brittany Griner, when I was ambassador in Moscow, I remember going with my family to watch Russian women's professional basketball games, and there were a number of WNBA stars, best American players in the world, who in the WNBA offseason would compete there. And these incredible women were very popular figures in Russia, which makes it all the more awful and shameful to see this today. So I know that the White House is working very hard to secure her release and working very hard on the Paul Whelan case as well.
Why does Putin want Victor Bout back so badly?
That's a good question, because Victor Bout's a creep.
Do you see a good outcome, despite the fact that we are involved, deeply involved in this war, and relations with Russia are at the worst they've been since the Cold War?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And the Trevor Reed case, gives you a little bit of faith that that's possible. And it certainly won't be for a lack of serious effort on the part of the White House or the State Department or anyone else.
The CIA director also said that he thinks that China's President Xi Jinping is determined to control Taiwan. No time frame for that he could or will predict. But he thinks that the lesson that President Xi has taken from what's happened with Putin and Ukraine is do not attempt to take another country by force quickly and have a decisive victory if you have underwhelming force. So use overwhelming force.